Today on AE Blues, we are going to explore color-managed workflows in After Effects. This is a practical After Effects tutorial, which is a two-part series. In the first part, I will demonstrate color managing in different working color spaces. I will show you a workflow for each, how to set it up, what settings to check or uncheck, what are the limitations, and show you comparisons. In the second part of this tutorial, I will implement these workflows on real project scenarios and demonstrate a full workflow with color managing and compositing to see exactly how to do it, what to watch out for, and share when would I typically use each workflow. Right after this. In this tutorial, I won't be getting too much into explanations about why I use color management or the color math behind these practices. There's plenty of information out there on the theory and principles, but what I try to do here is create a practical guide to refer to when dealing with color management in After Effects. For information about color management and linear workflow, I've put links in the description. Special mention to this article by Stu Masowich from ProLoss website, which does an amazing job explaining such a complicated topic. For the ACES color managed workflow demonstrated here, you will need to install two things. One is the OCIO plugin from Fnode website. OCIO is a free open source plugin for managing color made by Brandon Bowles. There's a short manual and I encourage you to read it. You place the plugin in the plugins folder in your After Effects application folder. The second thing you need to install is the OCIO configuration files. I would advise to install just the latest ACES library, which is currently 1.2. You place it in the location written here in the bottom of the screen. In this tutorial, I will be managing my color manually using effects and plugins, so I won't use After Effects native color management. I will keep these project settings. Working space is none. I will use 32-bit float. In Assume Working Gamma, you can leave it at the default, which is 2.4. It doesn't matter for the purpose of this tutorial because we are color managing manually with effects and plugins. If you are using After Effects 2022, it's recommended to use tetrahedral interpolation to get better accuracy for lookup tables. For the first part of this tutorial, I'm going to compare color managing in different working color spaces using this composite. Let me introduce you with the assets I got here. I got a log footage. This is shot with RE Alexa camera. You can find this footage in the RE website. Also have this Rec 709 photo. This is a still photo in 8-bit Rec 709. Also have this fire, Rec 709. It's on black background, so I'm going to composite it using the screen blend mode. Also have this linear sRGB multipass composite. Let me show you what I got inside. These are EXR passes, composited one over the other with the proper blend modes to create this rocket. I also got a beauty pass so I can compare that I'm getting the same appearance I had in the 3D app. Now, for this multipass composite to work, I must composite these passes in the same color space which they were created in, which is linear light. And since we are manually color managing After Effects, we will need to take care of the color conversions ourselves. In short, what we can do is add color profile converter to each pass, keep the default settings, and just check this, linearize. This way we linearize each pass. So we do this to all the passes. Then to view this whole multipass sandwich properly, we can add an adjustment layer with the same color profile converter, only this time we remove the linearization by checking that it's going from linear to non-linear. And you can see we get the exact same appearance. The explanation for this is a bit complicated, but it's important to understand. When you import an EXR file to After Effects, it automatically applies a gamma adjustment internally. This way, it will be viewed properly without you having to do anything. You can see in the project settings, when there is no working color space enabled, After Effects assumes a certain gamma for linear light. You can see here, for linear light, it will be converted to a gamma using what is written here. Now, this is a good thing. If you have EXR files, you want After Effects to auto-adjust. Maybe you have a beauty pass and you want to work in sRGB or Rec 709 gamma, and you don't need to work in linear. But when you are doing multipass composite with blend modes, they must work in the same way they did in the 3D app, which all work in linear. This way, when you composite them, you will get the exact same appearance. So again, you need to remove the gamma, composite. Later, you can decide if you want to apply the gamma back again. This is a guide layer, so it won't render. I want to keep it linear because when I composite, I can decide if I want to go from linear to any other color space. And we're going to see that later when we advanced in color managing our composites. Let's go back. And lastly, I got this high dynamic range EXR still photo. You can see that if I put my cursor over the highlights, you can see that in the info panel, it's showing values way over 1. I'm setting my info panel to show decimal so I can see these values. And the lumetri is also set to HDR. I'm going to just set it to float and I can see that the values are over 1. That's enough for me right now. And let's go inside. Now this is again an EXR pass, so we know that After Effects adds gamma adjustment. I want to remove the gamma adjustment. I will add a color profile converter with the default settings and linearize. This way I remove the gamma. Going back. So this was kind of a preparation work with color managing to just get to the starting point. Now let's continue on. And we're going to start with color managing in display color space. The two common display color spaces today are sRGB and Rec 709. We're going to composite in Rec 709. So all the footage which is not in Rec 709 color space needs to be converted to that space. For transferring from one color space to another, we will use After Effects Color Space Transfer Tool, which is Color Profile Converter. So we'll start with the log footage. We need to bring it from the camera's profile into a Rec 709 profile. So input profile, I'm going to go to RE log C. This is the standard exposure index 800 for the RE Alexa camera to Rec 709. For the still and the fire, they are already in Rec 709, so I don't need to do anything. For the linear sRGB, same with color profile converter, going from sRGB linear to Rec 709. For the sRGB EXR, I can do the same, copy, paste. And that's it. I have successfully color managed the composite. Now I can start with color correction and with compositing. For example, add exposure effect, place it before the color transform and reduce exposure or play with the gamma. And same goes for anything else in here. Another method I could use, instead of doing this manually, I can just lose the exposure and lose the color profile converter and use a lookup table that already converts the footage from log to Rec 709 with a look. Let's see, example in Lumetri. You can see that you have presets here for Alexa. You can use the default, and you can see it creates kind of a roll-off in the highlights. So also converting from Alexa to Rec 709, but also applies kind of this look, a curve, to get those nice highlights back and not overexpose them. So you can decide which method you prefer to use, either going neutral to Rec 709 and applying color adjustments, or going with a LUT method, which also has different sliders here, but you're better off doing exposure before the LUT and not after, because these controls are after the LUT is applied and will clip the highlights. Let's see how I can adjust this photo, which has overbrights values above 1. I can add exposure and put it before the color transform. And you can see that if I push it back, I can get back those highlights. Now, remember that in the project settings, we worked in 32-bit. See what happened if we change that to 16-bit. Notice the highlights there. You can see it's clipped because in 16-bit integer, you can't go over 1. So that's why we use 32-bit. Now, if you don't have values over 1 in your assets, then you could use just 16. The reason to not use 32 is because it's intensive for After Effects. But if you want to restore those highlights, you're going to have to work in 32-bit. I'm going to lose that and go back to the starting point. So I'm going to remove this and just keep it with the lookup table look. So you see that we have here a classic use case for using color management. We have sources from different color spaces, and instead of guessing with color corrections, where should I adjust them, I can bring them to a common color space and have a better, more accurate starting point before I even start to composite. So far, this workflow was quite easy, but what happens when you need to bring this composite to a colorist or an editor that wants to get the whole information of the color? You already baked the color transform in the footage. Let me show you an example. What happens? I can render. I'm going to choose ProRes 444. Make sure it's trillions of colors. Just render, bring it back, and just place it back into the composite. Now, it's of course accurate. Everything is exactly as it was. But what happens when I try to do exposure? Now you can see I am losing the highlights because this information is already baked into the footage. And what I'm looking for is a response similar to this, where I can restore those highlights. And this is crucial in scenarios where I am only part of the post-production pipeline, and this composite needs to go further to a colorist or an editor who does the grading. So my problem is I'm not able to produce a round trip where the pixels that are not manipulated look identical. So let's try to solve this problem. I'm back where we started, and we're going to try to color manage using a log working color space. Now let me just say this is not the right way to do this, but it is a way that can work. Log is good color space for color work, but it's not so much for most compositing tasks. We're going to see why. This method can work, but it depends what you need to do, and we're going to see where it works and where it breaks. To see the result properly, I can use an adjustment layer. On the adjustment layer, I will use color profile converter with input as RELOC-C white color gamut exposure index 800 to Rec 709. Or if I have a LUT, I can use that and get a tone map version with a highlight roll-off look for the composite. I set them both as guide layers because I don't want them to render. It's intended right now to be my display view as I work in log working color space. So now the log looks right, but everything else doesn't. Let's fix that. We need to bring all the footage assets to the color space of the camera. For the Rec 709, we're going to use, again, color profile converter going from Rec 709 to the camera's profile. Same with this layer. For linear sRGB, we're going to use sRGB linear to the camera's profile. And same for this footage. Let's compare it to the display color space. And you can see there's something off. This layer, the fire, is boosting up the values in the shadows. And the reason is I'm using a screen blend mode. Now, once I place the color profile converter from Rec 709 to RE-Log-C, the black is not black anymore. So it's not removed when I use the screen blend mode. I can fix that using the levels effect. And what I will do is clip the black and just reduce it like this. And now you can see I'm not changing the shadows. So these are the kind of problems you're going to face when you try to composite in log working color space. But the advantage is right now, when I render this. So whoever gets this footage later can have all the information, all the color fidelity is stored, same as with the log version, to do VFX or to do color correction. Unlike before, if I place exposure, you can see I can restore the highlights. If we compare it to the display, working color space composite, it's exactly the same. It's just the fire. I can do some color correction to maybe blend it better. The result here did solve a problem for me, but it created other problems. Now compositing is more difficult. So let's see how to do this with the linearized workflow. I'm back where we started. Working in linear is the right way to work in VFX. High-end compositing apps work this way. 3D apps work this way. It will give you the most flexible, accurate, and realistic results. While the two other workflows can work safely in 16-bit, with the exception of compositing with HDR values, here you must always work in 32-bit. In this workflow, we will follow the following procedure. We will choose a common color space for all our assets and make sure all of them are in that color space. Convert them if necessary. Then we will linearize that color space. Thirdly, we will add an adjustment layer on top from linear to any output we need. Let's see how to do that. I will use RE-Log-C white color gamut as my common color space, but you can choose others. So to convert to that color space, I'm placing a color profile converter on the log footage from RE-Log-C white color gamut to the same profile, and I check this box, linearize. For the Rec 709, from Rec 709 to RE-Log-C white color gamut, linearize. Same for the other Rec 709 layer. For linear sRGB, from sRGB linear to RE-Log-C white color gamut, linearize. And same goes for the other sRGB footage. Then I will place an adjustment layer going from RE-Log-C white color gamut linear to RE-Log-C white color gamut. This will be my log render. So when I render, I can render this. On top of that, I can place an adjustment layer going from RE-Log-C white color gamut to Rec 709, or I can place a LUT with tone mapping the highlights. Now, when working in linearized workflow, some things need to be different from the way you are used to compositing in After Effects. For example, in linearized workflow, you're not using the screen blend mode, you use the add. When you use camera lens blur, you should uncheck this, use linear working color space because you are already in linear. And when using exposure, you should check bypass linear light conversion. Also, you may notice that effects will behave differently. We're going to address that later in the real world example when compositing in a linear workflow. So let's compare the linearized composite with the log composite. So you can see everything is the same because we're applying the same adjustments, but the fire is different. When compositing in a linearized workflow, you will get a much better composites they will look more natural, where in log, you will have to struggle more to get the same result. Let's compare it with the display composite. And you can see that in the linearized composite, because I'm under a lookup table that creates a roll-off, things look less exposed. You can see it in the photo and also in the fire. Now, how the tone mapping affects your textures is not necessarily a bad thing, but if you want, you can adjust that by applying exposure. Don't forget to check this. And add more exposure to the fire and also to the insert, or play with the gamma to get a better result. Let's see other effects. What about blur? I've applied camera lens blur, remove this checkbox, and you can see how the blur looks here. And let's compare the same blur in the log composite and the display composite. In the linearized workflow, the results look much better. When we need to render, we can export to any format we want, to log or to Rec 709 with a LUT, or we can use any of these presets like sRGB, maybe add exposure before to just fix the highlights. And I can also export to linear. When you export to linear, I typically use EXR DWA. Just make sure that in the color management tab, you choose preserve RGB. This way you prevent After Effects from adding a gamma adjustment upon export. So now if I bring this back, now After Effects automatically adds a gamma upon import. It's confusing, I know. And I can add color profile converter to linearize it. So this is actually what was rendered, same as the composite. This is one advantage in linear workflow. The other advantage is my compositing is better. I get more realistic effects. I don't have to struggle too hard with trying to composite on log. My blurs and my glows are much better. So why not stop there? While linearized workflow is the right way and is still used frequently in VFX production, what it lacks is a standard. As you know, we use color profile converter in After Effects, which uses these profiles. These are called ICC profiles. This is something unique to the Adobe environment. But if we work with multiple platforms, it would be better if we had a standard, the same way to convert from one color space to another, the same library in each platform. Also, the linearized common color space we used was so far arbitrary. What if we had one linearized color space optimized for compositing work and one log color space optimized for color? This is something we can have with ACES. Let's see how to set it up. We're back, and let's color manage using an ACES pipeline. This procedure is very similar to the one we did in a linearized workflow. This is also a linearized workflow. We convert all our assets to a common workspace. This time it's ACES CG, which is already linearized, and we place an adjustment layer on top to convert from ACES CG to any output we need. For the color conversions, we will be using OpenColor.io, which we installed previously. You can see here in the configuration, it has detected we placed the ACES 1.2 library in the proper folder. And now I have all these options open. And let's start with this log footage. I'm going to input ARI. This is ARI log C exposure index 800. Going to ACES CG. For the Rec 709, I'm going to go to Utility, Rec 709 Display, to ACES CG. Same for the other Rec 709. For the multipass, I'm going to go to Utility, Linear sRGB to ACES CG, and same with the other float sRGB. Now, I'm going to place an adjustment layer on top, going from ACES CG back to the same RE C profile. And I've successfully made a round trip. On top of this, I can decide to do all sorts of adjustment layers to convert to display color space. For example, I can use a straight conversion to Rec 709 using the RE profile, going to utility Rec 709 display. You can see it's a straight conversion. I don't have tone mapping. Or I can use the ACES look for Rec 709 by choosing output to Rec 709. You can see it has tone mapping and it has a certain look. Or I can use a lot, going from Alexa to Rec 709. As you can see, same as before, because we are under a lot that does tone mapping, our textures may need to be boosted up. I can use, same as before, exposure. Don't forget to check this because we are in a linear workflow, and boost up the exposure, maybe play with the gamma until it looks right. Don't forget that ACES is a linear workflow, so no screen blend mode, only add. Let's try to do something with the fire here. Let's turn off the adjustments, and I'm going to place my cursor here on the fire. Now, this footage is not an HDR footage, but I can tell ACES to treat it as if these values are overbrights. If I change the input space to output Rec 709, you're going to notice that I'm seeing overbright values if you look in the info panel. Now, if we look at the fire, it appears that it's unaffected by the tone mapping. And in addition, since these are now HDR values, I can get nice glows and blurs. More about that in the second part of the tutorial, where we're going to see effects with ACES. So instead of using Rec 709 display, you can use output Rec 709 when you have footage where you want the whites to be considered as overbrights. Be careful of side effects. For example, you can notice that when I remove the layer, I'm seeing a jump here in the shadows. And if we examine this, you can see if I place my cursor on the black, it's not exactly black. So I'm not sure exactly why this happens, but we know already how to fix it because we did kind of the same thing when we had a problem in the log workflow. I can place a levels effect and clip to black, and I can just enter this value. And now I fixed the issue. For the insert, I didn't use this method because I didn't want the whites to be considered overbrights above 1. So I just used exposure, and I didn't fine-tune this yet, but I can make a better composite later if I want. Now let's talk more about the ACES display output transform. So far, I have been using this lookup table to convert to display color space. But ACES has its own color transform outputs for display. All these profiles, similarly to the technical lookup table we use for RE, these include tone mapping for all common display devices and are optimized for displaying the scene as accurately as possible. So when I use the ACES output in an adjustment layer, I am now fully implementing the ACES pipeline. And of course, other stations, the color, 3D, or editor, should use the same display output to see what I'm seeing. So if the colorist has ACES color management, we can use the same look. I will add a blur and compare the ACES composite with the previous ones. When we want to render an intermediate format, if we have other station using the ACES pipeline, we would typically output to the linear ACES 2065-1 color space and an EXR export. We could also render the ACES law color space known as ACES or ACES CCT in a QuickTime ProRes 444 export. And if we are not using ACES further down the road, we obviously can also render in a camera log profile, same as we did in the previous workflow. So by now, you might understand why many consider ACES pipeline to be the ultimate way to work, because it gives me a standard for all my color conversions from input to output. I now have one color space for compositing, ACES CG. I have one color space for log, which is ACES CCT. One intermediate color space for rendering, which is ACES 2065-1. I have an extensive profile library, which include color transform for most common cameras. And if you are not seeing your camera in here, you can try using other tools or applications like DaVinci Resolve to convert from your camera's color space to one of ACES common color spaces like ACES CCT for log or ACES 2065-1 for linear. Then import that to After Effects. And of course, I also have output transforms for any display device with tone mapping included. And all of this is not limited to a certain platform, whether it's a grading app or 3D. Some of them already have the OCIO internally. In After Effects, it does require installing. It's not very fast, and generally, it's not for every purpose. In the second part of this tutorial, we will examine typical use for each workflow that was demonstrated here with real-world examples.